Hello everyone, this is Ed Runkle, pastor at Tapestry Church, seen here weekly on LCTV channel 66, and you may see us live every Sunday morning at 10:30 at 22 Crady Avenue. Good morning everybody, welcome to Tapestry Church. I'm so glad you're here. Hey, I wonder if you guys have ever noticed that American fans of the winners of big games, they tend to riot and set fires and break things and threaten police and all of that. You know, in other countries, sports violence is a problem, but my impression is that it's usually losers and fans that, feel cheated that start tearing things up. But you may recall back at the end of the collegiate football season this past year, Ohio State beat Oregon for the collegiate football championship, national championship. There were no riots in Oregon, but the victorious Ohio State fans felt so happy that, about their win that they set, 89 fires. I mean, is that just part of, the systems of the world and how the world thinks and operates, or at least how American sports culture operates, or maybe American collegiate campus culture operates? Here's what I'm trying to get at. There are ways in which the world thinks and operates, and it's probably fairly safe to say that generally speaking, those ways differ from the ways that Jesus thinks and operates. And so those of us who claim allegiance to Jesus, in some sense, must be out of sync with the world. And it's not such a simple thing to figure out. How do we do it? Well, that's what we're going to think about this morning. And I want to read a couple of verses from a letter that the Apostle Paul had written to the first century church in Rome. And this is from chapter 12. It's verses 1 and 2, where Paul writes, "I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect." See, Paul is inviting us into a life that is no longer controlled by the systems of this world. For example, think about how often you may have heard someone say, or maybe you've said it yourself, follow your passion or follow your heart. I mean, this follow your passion is routinely dispensed as though its wisdom were both incontrovertible and equally applicable to all, but it's not. I mean, in our culture, according to the world, passionate feelings are used to justify pretty much anything from angry words to spending money we don't have to committing adultery. How often have you heard someone explaining what they did by saying, I just felt that it was the right thing to do, or I know, I really ought to do such and such, but I just don't feel like it. For many of us, our feelings dictate how we live. They impact the level of our motivation. They influence who or what we love, and very often we allow our feelings to determine what we will or will not do. As someone once put it, one can be the master of what one does, but never of what one feels. In other words, you can exercise some control by sheer will over your actions, but your feelings? Well, that's a different story. You can't control what you feel. It's like spitting into the wind to try to control it, right? Well, I suppose, but what happens when you feel one way and yet you should feel something else? What happens when you know, for example, that you shouldn't be angry at your spouse or your child, and there's no basis for any anger or hostility, and yet there you are, fuming? What do you do then? Do you simply let yourself fizzle out, or you wait to do something until you feel differently? Or do you act anyway, even when, and maybe most especially because, your feelings contradict what you know to be true? Do you apologize or forgive or sacrifice, not because you feel like it, but because it is good and right and true? Do you do it, in other words, as an act of faith because you know it's what God would have you do? That is, while you acknowledge what you feel to be real, you submit yourself to a greater reality, a higher calling, a more important truth. You refuse to be governed by what your senses tell you in the moment and instead believe something different. Holy shift. Or think about it like this. Have you ever noticed the Bible talks about demons? And honestly, sometimes I have a hard time trying to figure out, what to make of those texts in Scripture. I'm never sure if back then they had exactly the same kinds of things that we have going on in our day, but they didn't know, about epilepsy or mental illness, and so they just called it all demon possession. Or maybe there used to be demons possessing people, but sort of like polio and smallpox, it's just not something we have around very much anymore. Or maybe it just makes it more understandable and controllable for us in our day to use medical and scientific terms to describe those things that possess us. I mean, many of us in this room have suffered from addictions and compulsions and depressions, things that have gotten a hold of us, making us do things we didn't want to do, keeping us from doing things we knew we should do, or making us think that we love things or substances or people that were really destructive. Paul, in his second letter to the church in Corinth, refers to what he calls as strongholds. That is, he uses this military word for a fortress, and Paul uses the image to speak of these established or entrenched ways of thinking and acting and reacting that are in opposition to the ways of God. And Paul says we build these strongholds for defense purposes. As we engage in arguments to rationalize our behavior, as we elevate our pretensions to pat ourselves on the back, as we entertain thoughts that continue to feed us bad information and impact our feelings in negative ways, we keep building these strongholds. And Paul says these need to come down. It reminds me of something that Mark Twain once said. He said, "What a wee little part of a person's life are his acts and his works. His real life is led in his head and is known to none but himself. All day long the mill of his brain is grinding, and his thoughts, not those other things, are his history." Well, I would maybe add to Twain's statement by saying that our thought life then forms the basis for and is largely revealed in our actions and words. Put it another way, our attitudes will define us. Our mental habits will shape us. What's going on in our heads will govern what we do and how we live. And to all of this, Paul says to the Roman church, to you and to me, the primary way God changes us is by renewing our minds. To the Corinthian church, he puts it a little differently. He says, we're to take every thought captive. Those thoughts that are feeding the things that are taking us captive, the angry thoughts, the resentful thoughts, the lustful thoughts. And so the question is, how are our minds renewed? How do they get renewed? How do we take our thoughts captive? Well, let me say, for one thing, this is what's so significant about daily or regular devotions and Bible reading. I mean, we're completely wrong-headed when we lapse into the thinking that daily devotions or Bible reading are somehow, they win merit points with God. These devotions aren't for impressing God or anybody else. They're for daily pointing us in the right direction, for renewing our minds and fueling the energy of our thought life and our trust in God. I mean, thinking about putting our trust in God, did any of you guys happen to see that Florida's Pinellas County Sheriff's Department they got a nice rug for the entrance of their office building a while back, and then a couple of months later, after the rug had been down and in place, someone finally noticed that instead of it saying, "In God we trust," it said, "In dog we trust." And can you say, oops? I'm no kidding. You can Google this when you get the chance later. But here's what I'm trying to get at. It's our minds get renewed as we put our trust in God, as we shift our minds or our preoccupation from self to God. I like the translation The Message by Eugene Peterson makes of these verses from Romans, where he writes, "So here's what I want you to do, God helping you. Take your everyday, ordinary life, your sleeping, eating, going to work, and walking around life, and place it before God as an act of offering, embracing that what God does for you is the best thing you can do for Him. Don't become so well-adjusted to your culture that you fit into it without even thinking. Instead, fix your attention on God, and you'll be changed from the inside out." Notice we get changed from the inside out when our attention is fixed on God. Our minds get renewed when our attention gets fixed on God. I mean, the main problem with the mind, Paul points this out to the Roman church in the very next verse, in verse 3, just beyond what we read earlier, that God isn't the treasure of our minds. We are. Our minds are consumed with ourselves. But our healthiest moments are when our minds are moving toward worship. I mean, holy shift. Heaven isn't going to be a hall of mirrors. Our problem with our minds is that they don't worship, don't delight in God, but are self-worshiping. Sometimes I'll hear people say something to the effect of, "I'm so glad it's Sunday, I'm so dry and so empty, I need to come to worship." Well, I don't want to sound harsh, but the reality is that's not how you're supposed to come on Sunday. What I hear when someone says, that is what they're saying in my mind is the only time I worship God is when I come here and the worship team plays. Well, Scripture says our whole life is to be turning to God. Every day we're to worship God, thank God, give ourselves to Him afresh, push away the stuff that would possess or distract us. I mentioned this idea of being possessed a moment ago by way of all the kind of demons that we struggle with. And think about it. Think about it like this. Maybe your demon of anger knows to steer clear of the gospel, lest you end up forgiving some donkeys behind you really want to punch in the throat. Or maybe your demon of inertia knows to avoid Jesus, lest it be cast off a cliff and you have to start showing up in your life. Or maybe your demon of compulsive eating knows to not listen to Jesus, lest it find itself in a lake and you sitting at Jesus' feet. Or maybe your demon of always having to prove yourself fears Jesus, since if you listen to Jesus and not that demon, you may start believing that it's not your performance that matters, but Jesus's. And then you'll have to stop over-functioning. I mean, holy shift. In Mark's biography of Jesus in chapter 5, there's a description of a guy who's possessed. And it's a description of someone who's completely isolated, who's out of control and alone and in pain. And out of control and alone and in pain, it is exactly where our demons want us. I mean, a holy shift in our thought life will not only involve a kind of shift of our occupation, our mind's occupation from self to God, but a shift from isolation into community. A community of faith each week to immerse ourselves once more in the gospel through hearing the word and periodically sharing at the Lord's table. In fact, I wonder if it isn't God's intention that we need each other, not in a creepy, codependent, having no boundaries sort of way, but in a bearing the face of Christ kind of way, when I can't see the face of Christ on my own, through my own eyes. I need you to do it for me. I mean, maybe you've noticed this. Maybe you've picked up on this. When you look at the healing texts recorded in the New Testament record, of Jesus' healing ministry, he doesn't just cure diseases, cast out demons, and then say, mission accomplished. He's always after something more. Because the healing is never fully accomplished until there's a restoration to community. People are healed of a disease. He tells the folks who are just standing around watching to go get the person something to eat. Or the widow's son is raised from the dead and he gives him back to his mother. Or a man is healed of demons and he's told to stay with his people and speak of what God has done. In the Jesus business, community is always a part of healing, always a part of the renewal, always a part of the holy shift. And how wonderful it is to come every Sunday into the liberating community of the local church. All week long, we swim in an ocean of judgment and negativity and scrutiny. We constantly have to comply with the demands of a touchy world. We never measure up. Then on Sunday, we walk into a new kind of community where we discover an environment of grace in Christ alone. And, when a church is actually an environment of grace like this, it's so refreshing for sinners like us. It's like we can breathe again. It's as if God simply changes everyone's topic of conversation from what's wrong with us, which is plenty, to what's right with Christ, which is endless. He replaces our negativity and finger-pointing and self-attack with the good news of His grace to the undeserving. I mean, holy shift. Who couldn't come alive in a new way in a community which inhales that heavenly atmosphere? So our minds are renewed. We experience a holy shift in our thinking when we shift our mind's preoccupation from self to God and when we shift from isolation into community. But what's the point? Why this kind of nonconformity to the ways of thinking and operating of the world? Are you guys aware that Tyndale House, a major Christian publisher, announced a while back that it stopped selling the book The Boy Who Came Back from Heaven by Alex Malarkey and his father, Kevin Malarkey? Did you see that in the news media? It was a best-selling book, first published in 2010, describes what Alex experienced while he lay in a coma after a car accident when he was 6 years old. Coma lasted 2 months. His injuries left him paralyzed, but the subsequent spiritual memoir, with its assuring description of miracles and angels and life beyond the world, became part of that popular genre which has become known as heavenly tourism. Well, not long ago, Malarkey said, I didn't do it. I didn't go to heaven. I said I went to heaven because I thought it would get me attention. Did I mention that this kid's last name is Malarkey? I mean, was that not a red flag to the folks at Tyndale? But here's what I'm trying to get at. Part of what Paul is saying here is that King Jesus is making a new people who will live like his people, who will call attention to Him and His way, new way of life. I think a lot of the time when we think about being changed or being transformed, we're not so interested in God. We're just tired of who we are and more interested in wanting to be a different kind of person so we can feel better about ourselves. And so much of our religious language and religious motive is about ourselves, justifying ourselves, improving ourselves, with God as a means to that end. Well, the fact of the matter is that that faith, it's not about you and it's not about me. Holy shift. I mean, that's shocking and appalling to most people because we're so used to thinking that religion is about us, even though we've learned to use language to suggest otherwise. But God didn't create the world for us to live incognito. In case you haven't picked up on this, God is radically God-exalting. He's the most God-exalting being in the universe. And see, God renews and transforms us in order so that we might put Him on display. When Paul talks about presenting our bodies as living sacrifices, this is what he's talking about. You know, God doesn't care about our muscular bodies, but our merciful bodies. Bodies that get up early and go to bed late, caring for people, showing up with your physical presence in people's lives. Bodies matter a lot, but not for the reason the world says. They're, to be models of mercy, not models for clothing. We probably need to tell our children and grandchildren that God has designed our bodies not to look a certain way, but to do certain things. Holy shift. The Bible is so eager that we invest our time not, most of it not in how we look, but in what we do for heaven's sake, presenting them as instruments for showing the reality of Christ's presence and kingdom here and now. Holy shift. The Old Testament sacrifices died on the altar. Paul says, be a living one. I mean, we do die. That is, we die to everything in our lives that would diminish what people think about God. So while the world will long to be the leader of the pack, we'll pray that we may decrease, that He might increase. And while the world will say, stand up for yourself, we'll deem others better than ourselves. And while the world would advise, if he hits you, then hit him back. We'll turn the other cheek. While the world will dream of servants and chauffeurs and bodyguards and personal trainers, we'll say, I've come not to be served, but to serve. Holy shift. Last month, January, we celebrated Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Day. And one of the things that King would talk about is that we must make history and not be shaped by history. And I especially love this quote where King said, most people are thermometers. They just record and register the temperature of the majority opinion, not thermostats that transform and regulate the temperature of society. To quote King again, he said, there are some things in the world to which men of goodwill must be maladjusted. I confess that I never intend to become adjusted to the evils of segregation, the crippling effects of discrimination, the moral degeneracy of religious bigotry, and the corroding effects of narrow sectarianism, economic conditions that deprive men of work and food, and the self-defeating effects of violence. And maybe you saw this in the news not long ago. A Florida police department got itself in hot water after using people's mugshots for target practice, and you'll be shocked, yes, shocked, to learn that the pictures were of black men. So just in case you were wondering if there are things in this world to which we must be maladjusted, there are. And think about what it would be like to live as a thermostat instead of a thermometer. Have any of you ever read any of the best-selling Arthur Malcolm Gladwell's books? I mean, he's a great writer, a great storyteller, and at 51, actually a good miler. He ran 4:51 at the Fifth Avenue Mile last year, and as one who's a half a decade or so older than Gladwell and a former mile myself, that's some serious speed. But anyway, he recently talked about writing his book, David and Goliath, Underdogs, Misfits, and the Art of Battling Giants, and he went to Winnipeg to visit a woman named Wilma Dirksen. 30 years ago, the Dirksens experienced every parent's worst nightmare. Their daughter, Candace, was abducted and murdered. Gladwell was amazed by something that Wilma said at the time. We would like to know the person or persons who murdered Candace, who they are, so that we can share, hopefully, a love that seems to be missing in these people's lives. She continued to say, I can't say at this point, I forgive this person, but as Gladwell noticed, the stress was on the phrase, at this point. And he writes, I wanted to know where the Dirksens found the strength to say these things. Where do two people find the power to forgive in a moment like that? And the answer was their Christian faith. It's a power that Gladwell, who grew up in a Christian home, was familiar with. but had gotten away from. And as he put it, I always believed in God. I've grasped the logic of Christian faith, but I had a hard time seeing, what I had a hard time seeing is God's power. But sitting in Wilma Dirkson's garden, he saw that power. He realized that the louder claims of material advantage and the world's ideas about power had him looking in the wrong place. But holy shift, seeing God's power in action led him to rediscover his faith through a thermostat. What if you and I were to live as thermostats rather than thermometers, for heaven's sake? Thank you for joining us at Tapestry Church this morning. We hope you enjoyed the message. For more information, you may check out our website or Facebook page, and you may see us live weekly at 22 Crady Avenue at 10:30. All are welcome.